Hi everyone, my name is Noemi Martinez, and today I will be doing a psychoanalysis on a famous psychological experiment by the name of Project MK Ultra, or as I like to call it, the War on Human Mind. When we think of psychological experimentation, we often imagine controlled lab settings, consent forms, and institutional oversight. But there is a chapter in American history where none of those safeguards existed. A chapter so secret, even the test subjects didn't know they were a part of it. The chapter is called Project MK Ultra, a covert CIA program under the pretense of national defense. Imagine waking up in a hospital setting with no memory of how you got there. You feel disoriented, afraid, and detached from reality. Days later, you find out you were a part of an experiment without your knowledge. You were drugged, hypnotized, maybe shocked, and the worst part, it was done by your own government. Project MK Ultra was one of the most covert and ethically devastating programs in American history. Launched in the early 1950s by the CIA, its goal was simple in theory but sinister in practice: to control the human mind. Through drugs, psychological manipulation, and trauma-based conditioning, MK Ultra aimed to create truth serums, erase memories, and implant new identities. But what it actually created was a legacy of psychological destruction, institutional betrayal, and ethical collapse. As John Marks' 1979 edition writes in his expose, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA was looking for techniques to control human behavior and was willing to subvert every moral principle to find them. The project was launched under the pretext of Cold War national security, but what it became was a sprawling, unethical network of experiments that aimed to control the human mind. In this psychoanalysis, I'll examine what MK Ultra really was, how it operated, what it did to its victims, and why it stands as one of the darkest violations of human rights in American history. We'll analyze it through psychological theories, ethical frameworks, and its long-term impact on trauma research, mental health, and public trust. MK Ultra officially began in 1953 under CIA Director Allen Dulles and was overseen by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist nicknamed the Black Sorcerer, according to O'Neill 2017 edition. Fearing that the Soviets and Chinese were developing mind control techniques, the CIA sought to gain the upper hand by conducting their own experiments at any cost. According to declassified documents, MK Ultra consisted of over 150 sub-projects involving universities, mental institutions, prisons, and even brothels disguised as safe houses. Most of the test subjects were completely unaware they were being experimented on, according to Mark's 1979 edition. The techniques used were as extreme as they were diverse. LSD and other hallucinogens were administered without consent. Hypnosis was used to implant false memories and suppress real ones. Sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and induced comas were combined with drug overdoses. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered at 20 or 30 times the standard voltage. Psychic driving, a technique pioneered by Dr. Edwin Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, involved sedating patients for weeks and playing repeated audio messages on loops to reprogram their minds. These depatterning techniques aim to erase existing personalities and rebuild them from scratch, according to Collins' 1998 edition. These weren't rogue tests. They were coordinated efforts involving prestigious universities like Harvard, Stanford, and McGill, all under covert CIA funding. These were not isolated incidents. They were systematic, secretive, and to top it all, funded with taxpayer dollars, hidden even from Congress for years. Victims, or subjects, were not criminals or terrorists. Many were from marginalized or vulnerable populations: psychiatric patients, veterans, prisoners, sex workers, and even children. They were chosen because they were vulnerable and disposable in the eyes of the state. The rationale was simple. They were people who wouldn't fight back, and their stories wouldn't be believed. Let's now explore the terrifying psychological logic that powered MKUltra. At its core, the project was about breaking down identity. CIA psychologists believed that if you could erase a person's sense of self, you could replace it with another, a blank slate, ready for reprogramming. MKUltra was based on the belief that identity could be broken down and reconstructed. It attempted to exploit the mechanics of the unconscious mind, something Freud theorized was vulnerable to suggestion, especially in altered states of consciousness. Through LSD and trauma, researchers hope to erode the ego, dismantling a person's ability to separate reality from suggestion. This concept overlaps with Freud's model of psychic structure, ID, ego, and superego, where destabilizing the ego can lead to psychic regression and dependency. And that's according to Freud's own theory, 1923 to 1961. This regression led to dissociation, a mental state where individuals detach from their thoughts, memories, or sense of identity. Victims experienced amnesia, hallucinations, disorientation, and sometimes permanent identity confusion. These symptoms mirror modern diagnosis of complex PTSD and dissociative identity disorders, conditions where the mind fragments to protect itself from overwhelming stress, according to Herman, 1992 edition. There was also a cognitive manipulation component. Victims were subjected to contradictory messaging, gaslighting, and information loops, inducing cognitive dissonance to induce mental breakdowns and dependency. These are now known tactics in modern psychological warfare and cult indoctrination. From a behaviorist view, MKUltra was a grotesque misapplication of classical conditioning. It violated every boundary of ethical conditioning and attempted to erase free will. People were punished into submission or rewarded for compliance, sometimes with silence, sometimes with pain. The goal was to create learned helplessness, a condition studied by Seligman, where individuals no longer resist abuse because they believe they have no control. Therefore, nothing will change. The program was rooted in a fear-based learning, which neurologically damages the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex areas responsible for memory and decision-making, a fact further validated by modern neuroscience and brain imaging. The mind in this case became the battlefield. These experiments were not grounded in healing. They were about subjugation of the will. If you're wondering how this was allowed to happen, you're not alone. And let's be clear, MKUltra was illegal, unethical, and morally indefensible. It violated virtually every principle in the American Psychological Association's 2017 edition Code of Ethics. No informed consent, no ability to withdraw, no protection from harm, and no transparency or accountability. Victims were often drugged without consent, denied the right to leave, and offered no psychological support. Some were hospitalized afterward. Others never recovered. Many were never even told that what had been done to them or that they had been part of a CIA experiment, subjected to irreversible psychological damage. This wasn't just unethical psychology. It was state-sponsored psychological abuse. One of the most infamous victims was Frank Olson, a military scientist secretly dosed with LSD, whom after displaying signs of psychosis, Olson allegedly committed suicide. But according to Mark's 1979, decades later, forensics evidence suggests that he may have been murdered in order to be silenced. What's even worse is the program's collaborators included well-known academic institutions, like Harvard, Stanford, and McGill, to name a few. Many of the collaborators were respected doctors and professors, whose only ethical compass was secrecy. As Moreno 2006 edition points out, MKUltra was more than a breach of ethics. It was a violation of the social contract. It represents the complete collapse of the researcher-participant relationship and the rise of state-sanctioned psychological abuse. These partnerships created the illusion of scientific credibility while hiding the fact that these were acts of psychological torture. It revealed how government, medicine, and science can conspire to turn individuals into tools. Even today, we only know a fraction of what happened. What remained was testimony, trauma, and fragments of the truth. In 1973, then CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most of MKUltra records destroyed. Survivors were left with trauma and no legal recourse. A few lawsuits have been successful, but most were dismissed or settled quietly. This wasn't just a rogue operation. It was systemic, deliberate, and protected by secrecy. MKUltra didn't just alter people's lives. It reshaped public perception of psychology and power. It shattered public trust in the government's role as protector. Even decades later, its name evokes fear, and for good reason. It forced a major overhaul of federal ethics policies. The National Research Act of 1974 led to the creation of Institutional Review Boards, or IRBs, which now review all psychological and medical research involving human subjects. It triggered a cultural reckoning. MKUltra is one of the most cited examples of institutional betrayal in American history. For many, it validated the belief that governments cannot be trusted to protect the mental integrity of its citizens. It helped shape our understanding of trauma-related disorders, particularly the effects of forced dissociation, memory manipulation, and institutional abuse. Valentine 2008 edition explains that the experiment's data, though poorly gathered, gave an intentional insight into how trauma rewires the mind. MKUltra inspired movies like The Manchurian Candidate and Jacob's Ladder, and more recently, shows like Stranger Things. These aren't just stories. They're cultural echoes of real events that the government tried to bury. It was real. It happened, and its wounds are still healing. But beyond fiction, according to Dick's 2016 edition, MKUltra also heightened skepticism around pharmaceuticals, psychiatry, and national security, shifts that are still felt today in debates over consent, surveillance, and bodily autonomy. To conclude, Project MKUltra was more than a secret program. It was a crime against the human mind. It turned science into a weapon. It stripped people of their agency, their memories, and in some cases, their futures. But we must remember it, not just to condemn the past, but to safeguard the future. As psychologists, researchers, and human beings, we must hold ourselves accountable not only to the pursuit of knowledge, but to the preservation of dignity, consent, and empathy. Today, we're fortunate to have laws and codes to protect research participants, but MKUltra teaches us a deeper lesson. When people are seen as experiments instead of humans, science loses its soul. The mind is not a battlefield. It's not a tool for government control. It is the most sacred space we have. It should never be colonized by fear, secrecy, or power. Thank you.